Let's move!
Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes!
Do you have a favorite toy from your childhood? Especially if you grew up with siblings? One that took a center stage in your play for years? For me, outside of Legos, which I still very much am into, it was Rescue Heroes, or the Rescue Heroes. I was fortunate in that for both me and my sisters, my parents went all in on the Rescue Hero toys in the late 90s and the early 1000s. The standard toys were a posable plastic doll with swappable backpacks pertaining to whatever rescue focus they had. They had rescue animal sets, vehicles, and an aircraft carrier. They also had a classic Sunday morning cartoon that ran for 3 seasons from 1999 to 2002, with a major shift in style and story between seasons 1 and 2. I was fully in on these toys as a kid. We had most of the VHS tapes of the show since they were often attached to the packages of individual sets. Most of the show was written and produced pre-9/11, so it didn't carry the same burden of propaganda that most shows usually do. Think Paw Patrol. Not that the 90s was perfect, but the show had this wonderful focus purely on the act of helping people who, through carelessness or just bad luck, had gotten themselves into life-threatening circumstances, wherever they might be in the world. The episodes even end with a G.I. Joe style lesson that actually relates something that could be helpful to kids. I might have rose-tinted nostalgia glasses on for this, but having rewatched a lot of it recently, I still stand by this show. During that rewatch, a pang of nostalgia during time at home during the first year or so of COVID, I did stumble upon something that has lodged stubbornly in my mind since. It was in the episode Trapped Beneath the Waves, which is a fantastic all-hands episode featuring the Aquatic Rescue Command Center, which my parents had got as a Christmas gift for my sisters and I. So the inciting incident is when a large storm causes a submarine to crash into a cruise ship, starting a fire and sinking this up. So this is great. We have multiple teams working on the evacuation, the fire, and the submarine. The rookie spends the episode in the Rescue Heroes CIC learning to think creatively and helps make sure all people make it home. After letting the nostalgia wash over me, I was left with one gnawing, irritating, inexplicable question. Who the hell operates that submarine? To those of you who watched my first essay, don't worry. We'll return to thoughtful character and horror content in the near future. Consider this the closed bracket of what you can expect from me. Some silly content about random media I love mixed in with the serious deep dives with lots of citations and such. Think of this as an exercise with almost no stakes on how we can choose to read stories we like in fun and interesting ways. Honestly, in ways that are fundamental to creating stories. This is honestly how I got my start in writing to begin with, in fanfiction. There's a lot to learn by looking for threads to pull, no matter how strange or trivial, so let's get into it. So if we want to keep this search semi-realistic, we should start at the logical place. What is a submarine? Well, it's not this, but it also isn't this. The simple difference is that a submarine operates as its own independent vessel, stopping at port to refuel and rearm like other surface vessels would. The first conception of modern submarines entered prominence in professional navies during the Russo-Japanese War, with multiple parties involved in the development on both sides. The world did not see full deployment of submarines in a modern sense as we would recognize them, until the lead up to the First World War, where the German U-boats of various classes dominated the North Atlantic, forcing other navies to catch up. Submarines also played a critical reconnaissance role at the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval battle of the war, and the single largest clash of battleships the world has ever seen. These two major uses of submarines began to show the major roles the vessels would undertake and be specialized in for the Second World War, surface raiding and reconnaissance. The submarines of this era were powered essentially the same way that a hybrid car is today. They would have a large diesel power plant on board and several large batteries. This gave submarines a much faster surface speed, where they could run the diesel engine, and a slower submerged speed on just the batteries. Submarines also would need to charge their batteries on the surface after a period submerged, regardless of conditions. I think there is a widespread misconception outside of boat nerds and naval personnel that submarines spend most of their time submerged, and while I understand how one gets that belief, it is not in fact true, at least for the diesel electrics. While surface running was more dangerous in terms of enemy detection, submarines could move faster and navigate easier on the surface, resulting in most of their time spent there. In order to run their diesel engine to charge the batteries, they had to vent the exhaust at the surface. This principle extends into the propulsion of modern diesel-electric submarines, which many countries still operate today. This means when we look at our modern example, the submarine featured in The Rescue Heroes, we cannot assume that it is a nuclear sub just because that is the predominant form of propulsion for most modern submarines. So let's try and determine some basics about the vessel. It's obviously in the shape that one would expect for a military vessel, and given the points of view the show gives us into the submarine, we can safely say that it is in fact military operated. So, first thing that stands out to me is the windows. I thought it might just be a cartoon flare, but there are actually many different types of submarines that have windows on the conning tower, such as the Soviet Foxtrot class submarine or the Chinese Yuan class. Both of these are diesel electric, and as best as I can tell, the US has no submarines with conning tower windows, favoring this thin style of conning tower. The only real exceptions I could find of US submarines with windowed conning towers are the Greyback class and the Sailfish class, which are also diesel electric, but were decommissioned in 1964 and 1977 respectively. With the US out of the running here, we can turn to the Soviets. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union at the hand of the great traitor and revisionist Gorbachev, much of its submarine program from the 70s and 80s continues to be operated around the world under several flags. The first submarine that stood out to me was the Soviet Foxtrot class diesel submarines, mostly due to the windows on the conning tower and the number of different operators, including Libya, India, and Poland. Now this submarine is a little small and much older than the late Cold War period we are looking at, and that brings us to its big brother. The Kilo class submarine is similar in many ways to the Foxtrot diesel submarine. It's Soviet design, multiple countries operating, and windows on the conning tower. But crucially, it fits into our late Cold War time period. Let's take one step back here, now that we've identified the Kilo class as the prime candidate. Other than windows as identifying features of the submarine, we can take a little cartoonish whimsy into consideration. First off, there are no control surfaces shown, and no torpedo tubes. This lets us widen the net just a little on our possible operators. The biggest indicators now are the location of the incident and the profile of the submarine, including its hull, rudder, and conning tower. starting with the simplest, the location. The show gives us a wonderful 90s map zoom in to let us know it's just off the coast of Australia in the Coral Sea. With that geography, there are only two local navies that operate submarines, the Royal Australian Navy and the Indonesian National Military Naval Force. Now, aside from these, there are a number of possible international operators who could be operating cooperatively or clandestinely in the Coral Sea. We will include in this list of navies that of China, Russia, India, Myanmar, Iran, Vietnam, the US, and Israel. Among these 10 candidates, we have 5 different possible submarines: the Kilo class, the Collins class, the Dolphin class, the Type 209, and the Los Angeles class. To begin the elimination, let's start with the obvious. The submarine that stands out greatest on this stage is the USN-operated Los Angeles class. Its profile is wrong, and it's the only nuclear submarine on this list, meaning it is unlikely to have the same problems that the submarine in the show had with needing to surface. The only real reason this makes the list is due to an incident less than 6 months before the release of the episode, where a Los Angeles-class submarine crashed into a large civilian surface ship. While its story is a strong contender and probably put the idea in the heads of the creators, this cannot be the submarine in the show. Let's move on to a close ally of the US, Australia, and their Collins-class submarine. This is a local navy and a diesel submarine, so it already stands higher than the Los Angeles. When we look at its profile, it is closer as well, with a stocky body and a more central conning tower. When we compare this to the remaining 3, though, we can eliminate it. It's on a technicality, though. The Collins has that the remaining 3 lack, but match the submarine in the show. And that is the placement of the dive planes. The Collins class follows Western convention, like US submarines, and mounts them on the conning tower, while the Type 209 mounts them on the forward ventral hull, and the Kilo and Dolphin mount them dorsally. If we need another look, the Australian Navy uniforms are not even remotely similar to those shown to us in the episode. That leaves us with 3 submarine candidates, and still several countries who might operate it. If we look strictly at uniforms, the way we did with the Australian Navy to eliminate the Collins class, we can eliminate China, Russia, India, Myanmar, and Iran. While that narrows down operators, that does not narrow down subs. Here's where the Kilo gets eliminated. 2 primary reasons: the shape of the conning tower and the shape of the aft control surfaces. The Kilo has a set of very large dive planes on the aft section and no vertical control surfaces, while both the Dolphin and the Type 209 do. The Kilo also has a more forward conning tower than either the Dolphin or the Type 209. Now, the Type 209 and the Dolphin class are far more alike than any others we've so far eliminated. The Type 209 was designed as an export-only vessel by a rehabilitated West German Nazi by the name of Ulrich Gabler and built by Volkswerk Deutsche Werft. This is the same shipyard. Quick interjection here. In the process of doing actual research for this very silly essay idea, I fell down an infuriating rabbit hole. So Ulrich Gabler, or Gabler, I don't care, fuck him. So Ulrich Gabler, the submarine engineer, I cannot affirmatively say he was in fact a reformed paperclip Nazi. In fact, there is sparse about him in terms of surface level research. I was able to find some mentions of him in some obscure HTML military blogs, but most were just regurgitating his Wikipedia quick facts. So I turned to possibly getting a copy of the book he wrote, Submarine Design. The title and the short summary imply this is unlikely to have much in terms of personal information, though. The book itself is out of print, and the Library of Congress's copy wasn't available. So I tried to find out biography, because someone this pivotal in the history of European submarine design has to have at least something, right? And yes, he does. An obscure book written by what appears to be a professor based in Lübeck. Not only is it in German, but if I bought a copy, it wouldn't get here until well after this essay was due to be published. And rest assured that if this was more important, I would actually do this, but I'm overanalyzing a Rescue Heroes cartoon. Translating a biography about a German engineer to determine firmly if he was a member of the Nazi Party or not is a little much. That said, given that he has the U-boat war badge and the War Merit Cross among other decorations from the Nazi era cited on his Wikipedia page from this book that I can't get my hands on, it tells me it's a really strong possibility. Also, he did make submarines for the Nazis, even if I can't prove he was one. Fuck this guy. Anyway, this shipyard, Hoofdwerke Deutsche Werft, also is responsible for the construction of the Dolphin classes of submarine. The Dolphin class actually started its service life as a heavily modified subclass of the Type 209, designed exclusively for the Israeli Navy. So these two submarines are neck and neck in terms of fitting the profile and function of the boat shown to us in the show. So, who's operating it? Based on everything the show gives us, the prime candidate is the Israeli Navy. The simple fact that their uniform matches closest to that worn by the crew, and could even be US Navy uniforms. It's not inconceivable that US Navy submariners could be on board for a training exercise. That in the Israeli Navy has had a number of incidents with both friendly and civilian vessels that raised the bar of possibility for an incident like this. Up until writing this, the Indonesian Navy was actually looking like a culprit here, but on my last little research pass, I realized I had misidentified their cadet corps uniform for their naval work dress uniform, which is very, very different. Now that we've solved this mystery, let's... Oh shit. Oh, fuck. I didn't think there'd be a name on the hull. Okay, let's do a quick Google search, and okay. Norg is a boss in Final Fantasy VIII. Cool. We love a weird guy, but that feels like we jumped from the classic pinups and Bruce Lee posters to naming entire vessels after a boss from your favorite video game. As in keeping with the theme of this video, I'm probably overthinking this, so the second result for the name Norg is a village in the Netherlands. That makes a little more sense. Naval vessels, especially submarines, are frequently named after cities. An Israeli submarine named after a small Dutch village seems very strange, though. The Dutch Navy does operate submarines, the Walrus class, but it's home designed and built. No connection to the Dolphin class. With no real practical explanation, we're left with two courses here. We can write it off as a loose end and marvel at the preposterous hyperfixation that has led me to identify the Israeli military as the operators of a submarine from one episode of a 90s kids cartoon. Or we could pull a thread and see just how deep the rabbit hole goes.
You've lost another submarine.
Establish air position from which to mount aggressive attack.
You're the best explosive expert we have.
What do you think?
Of all the boneheaded stunts, this one takes the prize. Ensign, situation report.
You heard it hit the hull, and I was never here.
Please may I express my concern as calmly and as respectfully as I will allow it.
Okay, so let's get weird with it. We're rolling back to square one, and then some here, and we need to decide what world the rescue heroes exist in. My bet is on an alternate history, like how the Fallout franchise has one major divergence point, or for anyone who's not familiar with Fallout, the way Back to the Future explains timeline tangents.
Prior to this point in time, somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent, creating an alternate 1985. Alternate to you, me, and Einstein, but reality for everyone else.
The show features a number of real cities with very little difference to the real world, other than the presence of the rescue heroes themselves and being in a cartoon. The timeline of the show makes mention of the rescue heroes' formation and that their rookie recruit joined 2 years after, which would make the start of the show just 2 years after the unit was actually created. This can give us an internal reference point, so let's look for something external. One large landmark stands out in the episode 4 Alarm Fire and Brimstone, which features a volcanic eruption in the Philippines that has, according to the show, been dormant for over a century. So let's zero in on this. The island is inhabited with a ferry system, and the volcano is central. There are about 27 active volcanoes in the Philippine Islands, and if we look at eruptions that caused large-scale disruption during the 20th century, we're looking for one that hasn't erupted in a while and is located on an inhabited island. The closest match that stands out is Camaguin Island, which last had an eruption in January of 1954 and is responsible for the second deadliest eruption in the Philippines during the 1900s. So it's capable of producing devastating eruptions. This gives us a point B to manage our view of the rescue heroes' place in time, about 100 years after the last eruption of significance on Camaguin Island. So the first season of the show is somewhere between 2055 and 2060, approximately. This is further supported by the sometimes outlandish and massive disasters they face. We have already, in the 2020s, seen a steady acceleration of once-in-a-century events, as the effects of ignoring climate change become more and more apparent. It would make sense that at some point a high-level rescue corps could be formed to help respond to disasters on an international level. Returning to the submarine for a moment, the rescue heroes had access to the full schematics of the vessel, so this reinforces the idea of them being a national and or even supranational entity with a strong affiliation with the operator of the submarine. For those who might not be aware, that's a big no-no unless the people helping you are close allies or your own military or rescue teams. During the Kursk disaster, for example, in 2000, the Russian Federation refused multiple offers of assistance despite not having sufficient equipment to complete the rescue. After they finally did accept some help from a Norwegian dive team, they dismissed them immediately after they were able to locate and gain access to the sub. The official reason given was to protect state secrets. Given that we have a timeline in the future, we can look at some possible new classes of submarine which could have developed. I think it's still fair to remove the US from consideration here, given that the profile still doesn't match the standard design of US submarines. This leaves us with a submarine that is likely German or Russian by design, possibly both if we keep our minds open to a number of possibilities. The US obviously still exists in this world, and we have hints that the US is subordinate to the entity that created the rescue heroes, whether by choice or not.
You must be Sheriff Winslow. I'm Billy Blake. I know who you are. Remember, this is my jurisdiction. What I say goes. Actually, item 342 of the International Safety Manual says that the rescue heroes supersede any authority at any given time.
Now let's take another look at the uniforms the submariners are wearing. It's a work dress uniform, which makes it a little difficult to place exactly given the simplicity of the clothes. But if we look at the color pattern on the decorations of the uniform, we can find a clue. I bet some of you already recognize those as Germanic flag colors. Let's take a look at who used them. Belgium is the first and obvious choice, but they operate exactly 0 submarines. And most of their navy was designed and built by their neighbors, the Netherlands. Angola uses the same color scheme for their flag and does have a professional navy, but has no submarine fleet. Uganda also uses these flags, but it is landlocked, so that leaves us with Germany in some form or another. Germany is also the closest plausible submarine operator to the village of Norg, despite it not being within German territory. So let's do a quick review of the course adjustment we've been doing here. The submarine entrapped beneath the sea is likely of German design, if not also German operated, and is named for a city in the Netherlands. The rescue heroes themselves exist as or are chartered by some supernatural entity that the US is subordinate to in specific circumstances, and this same entity has full access to the design schematics to a military submarine it is not directly operating. Clearly, the balance of political power in this paradox-ass alternate history is much different than our own, so to try and narrow this further, let's look at some of the major political shakeups occurring around the time the rescue heroes were created, see if anything could stand out overtly or subconsciously as influences on the creators' minds. The Rescue Heroes toy line was launched by Fisher-Price in 1997, and the animated cartoon was released in 1999 by the Canadian animation company Nelvana. Their most notable other projects were Little Bear, Pippi Longstockings, and the Magic School Bus TV show. I was honestly kind of surprised, because these were also big pictures of my childhood. See, Mom, you exposed me to foreign media as a child, and that's why I'm trans today. Anyway, when we look at the largest political upheavals that opened the decade of the 90s, we see the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany. This paved the way for the formation of the European Union in 1993, and the spread of consensus neoliberalism as the former Soviet states were having the copper wire stripped out of their countries at the end of a NATO gun or an IMF pen. So why is the collapse of the Soviet Union relevant to the rescue heroes? Well, no art is produced in a vacuum. We all include things consciously and subconsciously in what we create because we are shaped by the world we are born into and live within. This is a fairly strong undercurrent to a lot of analysis I do, both fun and serious, so it bears repeating. Art is not produced in a vacuum. Apolitical art is a fiction. And when someone says their art is not political, what they mean is their art reflects the status quo of where they stand in society. The assumptions and worldview expressed in art can tell you a lot about where the creator sits within society, even if the creator themselves tries to obscure it. The creators of the show would have had their perspective very similar to many in the Western world of the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the proverbial end of history, but being just outside the pole lists of the Imperial Core means their experience of those events would be dramatically affected by their place in the world. Their visions of the future of the development of the world could be very different than the average American viewpoint. From this adjusted bearing, we can now look at the values the rescue heroes espouse in the context of the show. This can give us a sense of the world they live in, this paradox alternate history. There's a heavy focus on dedication to the mission of the rescue heroes, ensuring the safety of all human life. Along with that primary tenet, the show and its characters edify the value of sacrifice and perseverance in the face of overwhelming natural and man-made disasters, wherever in the world they might occur. This ethos is inherently cosmopolitan, with almost all episodes featuring 2 or more countries all over the globe. through all of these missions in dozens of different countries on all continents, there is only one where the local rescue officials push back on their response: the United States.
Remember, this is my jurisdiction. What I say goes.
So this alternate world we're envisioning is one where an extraordinarily well-funded and well-equipped rescue force goes around the world responding to whomever is in need, and has a stiff rivalry with equivalent forces in the US. When we take the time and the world influences that the writers might have had in the back or forefront of their mind, what multinational or supranational entity might come to mind? No, not the Soviet Union. Despite my flirtatious relationship with USSR nostalgia, it was always going to fall apart. The Soviet Union was held together from glue made from mud and grain, and was never supposed to exist as the scarecrow of Imperial Russia with slightly better morals and per capita food consumption. It would be a little cheap, however fun, to imagine the rescue heroes are in the good timeline, where the Soviets aren't just a bunch of angry, racist Muscovites trying to hold together and control a country of dozens of formerly subjugated nations, cultures, and farming communities without addressing racism and power dynamics of the empire. The inability to learn this lesson is not limited to socialist governments. Russia, as this continent-spanning country, is an idea that will not last no matter what the governing ideology is. Neither will the United States. Anyway, now a more interesting idea of a historical divergence would be one where the Soviet Union collapsed, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, and Germany didn't reunify until way later in the decade. Stay with me on this. The IMF hammer comes down on a struggling Europe thrown into chaos. The Treaty of the EU is signed, and suddenly all these workers living in countries where austerity is mandated by forces outside their control have questions about why they should allow this to happen to them. For those of you who might not know or just aren't as politically literate, no judgment here, but austerity was a policy of essentially stripping back social welfare programs that make life more bearable and easier and make it so that you can eat and get healthcare, in favor of paying off national debts that was enforced as mandatory under IMF doctrine in terms of giving out loans to countries that needed them for development, and led directly to people dying. I highly encourage all of you to go read David Graeber's Debt, The First 5,000 Years. He goes into it in much more detail because he is incredibly smart, and I am a silly essayist talking about a kid's cartoon. Anyway, massive US military spending and its presence in Europe doesn't seem justified in the face of the early 1990s economic recession, and with the threat of the Soviet Union gone, the US pulls back on their support for the now teetering West German economy. It quickly collapses, and Germany becomes reunified before the end of the decade. This version of the DDR, in order to survive, would have to seek a new identity for itself and its mission as now the largest socialist state in Europe, having absorbed the weakened West Germany rather than the other way around. Their overtures to anti-imperialism and their project of an anti-fascist driven control of the state apparatus would have to be adjusted. Think glasnost without the perestroika, if you will. Openness without sacrificing socialism. Council communism, or some form, would likely begin to form along industrial and regional lines to create a large table that was worth having a seat at, rather than a waiting room for services like the last days of decay within the USSR. The DDR had always been separate from the development bloc of the Soviets, so they would be in a better position than any of the former USSR countries to adjust their approach to socialism and governance to survive in the new world that they faced. It would be strong enough in its own institutions and its appeal in rejecting consensus neoliberalism to survive reunification and incorporate the old states into the new. Over the struggle through the decade, as the promise of a new world, the end of history, failed to play out, instead of nothing but state capitalism and feudalist theocracy to turn to, like we have in the real world, this hypothetical world would have had a unified Council Communist Germany to turn to. Countries that were being captured by the EU would likely turn to a union with the DDR. Watching the failure of the Soviet Union, the DDR would pursue a political, defense, and economic pact with these countries rather than direct control. The Nordic social democracies would come first, then the Baltic states, the border countries, and the UK would be last, possibly splitting from England before, given the stronger socialist tendencies within the politics of Scotland, Wales, and the occupied north of Ireland. This would leave the DDR, which was also a member of the UN Security Council, as the largest power in Europe, having founded this supranational organization of socialist governance focused on anti-imperial outreach. This would come mostly in the form of material, health, and technical aid. As the years progressed, this mission would begin to run into the growing severity of climate change and capitalism's combined unwillingness and inability to deal with it. This would necessitate a specialized unit to respond to the increased likelihood and severity of disasters, similar to how today the US will deploy airborne troops or naval vessels to assist a country struck by natural disasters if they own enough US Treasury bonds. This is what leads to the formation of the rescue heroes and the allocation of their massive technical resources. Oh, and the Submarine, the boat that was the focus of this entire deep dive into a conspiracy wall of alternate history, or a Paradox game mod that I have not yet made. I'm going to say this was likely operated by the Volksmarine Niederländische Flotte. I'm thinking of a sort of the French Foreign Legion, brackets good, not doing Heart of Darkness stuff in Vietnam. The Confederation of European countries would have mutual outreach in terms of patrols and collective defense, and the Norg could be a submarine operated by the Dutch portion of a broader navy than just the DDR Volksmarine. This submarine would likely be an updated version of the Kilo-class submarine, or even an updated version of the Sarov class. This would fit not just because of the profile, but due to the special role the Sarov played as a specialty submarine with a unique propulsion method. This incident could have occurred during a test of that long-range propulsion system. An error caused them to surface in a storm, and then boom! We have our rescue heroes mission. So we have our two possible answers to this very silly question. The heavy air quotes, realistic possibility, and the crazy paradox universe alternate history. If we keep ourselves just to the real world, where the rescue heroes are magically dropped in, the Israeli Dolphin 1 is our likely culprit, but if we broaden our thought to an entirely different world, we find a much more complicated answer. I'm sure there are plenty of you, and some who never made it to this point, that think I am reading way too much into a Canadian's kid cartoon from the 90s. You're no fun if you think that. Fuck that. All my homies like deep dives into the rescue heroes. On a more genuine note, though, I actually find this exercise useful. It's honestly just fun on one end, a kind of hits blunt what if meme of an essay. It's a mix of nostalgia and actual research that lets us play in a low-stakes sandbox with real concepts. For those who don't know, I'm a political science major dropout. That's my highest education background, and I completed a few years of it before I left. I had one foreign policy professor that used to do this thought exercise with the zombie apocalypse. It was a really good example to use, actually. It tested all aspects of government, domestic and foreign, at the same time. Fans of World War Z already know this if you've ever read the book. The author played with those concepts in a surface level way. Being a little silly and having fun with media analysis is part of the joy that movies, shows, books, and games bring us. And taking it a little seriously, but not direly so, is a lot of what I want to do. You can certainly expect more of this kind of content from me, a deep dive into something niche and nostalgic to ask a question that can be fun to answer if not interesting as well. Now for a brief but jarring shift of tone before we wrap up. I tend to keep this final card as a sort of ad for things I think deserve ads. I'll try to be, I'll try to keep it a balance between creatives and causes I believe are worth checking out and supporting. We live in a world without rescue heroes to save people who are facing the kinds of extreme disasters the show centers on. The Red Cross and the Red Crescent do good work around the world, but there are blind spots within the coverage, and sadly, those blind spots are often the most in need. Headfirst al-Kurd, or the Kurdish Red Crescent, I know I just butchered that, is one organization that is filling the gap by providing much needed medical and humanitarian aid in the autonomous region of Rojava in northern Syria. Due to the government of Turkey not recognizing the Kurds' right to exist, they have worked to block and disrupt aid to the region from major international organizations, leaving the Kurdish Red Crescent the only major organization with some international support. I'll leave some links in the description on where you can donate, and I encourage you to do so if you can.
Let's move!
Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes! Rescue heroes!
Global Response Team.